There are many notable and great figures in history, many points of light in that vast, ever-stretching darkness. But very few shine so bright that they define entire epochs. And among that handful of titans stands one figure so draped in wonder and legend that his life has become nearly indistinguishable from myth. And though I am quite the fan, many of his actions fill me with a conflicted feeling. This is a man who burned down wonders of the world in drunken rages. He crucified 2,000 people along the walls of a defeated Persian city. Some years before, he killed nearly every man in Thebes, and then took the remaining population of 30,000 women and children as slaves. And yet, by the standards of other ancient conquerors, he was comparatively civilized. He allowed his defeated enemies to keep their religions, their customs, along with most of their populations. He established libraries and centers of learning, lighting beacons of knowledge throughout the darkness of the ancient world. This is a man who thought of himself as a mythical hero, on par with Heracles or Prometheus. A man we all still know, and whose name we still utter with awe and wonder, more than 2,300 years after his death. And that man is, of course, Alexander. It was said by Plutarch that on the eve of Alexander's conception, his mother, Olympias, was visited by a powerful dream. In it, a great bolt of lightning struck her womb, sparking a terrible fire that burned the entire world, before suddenly going out. Alexander of Macedon, who we now know as Alexander the Great, was born in ancient Macedon in July of 356 BC, the son and heir of Philip, king of Macedon and soon nearly all of Greece. Alexander's father Philip is a colossus in his own right, in many ways even more impressive than his much more famous son. From the age of 23 until his extremely public and suspicious assassination around 45, Philip had been conquering and consolidating power throughout all of Greece, growing and honing an army of exceptional lethality and efficiency. This army, perhaps the most dangerous in the world at the time, would pass to his ambitious son, Alexander, upon Philip's death. But if we are to begin to understand Alexander at all, it's not to his father that we must look. It's to his mother. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was only 18 when she became the second wife of King Philip. The daughter of a ruler of a neighboring territory, it was something like a political marriage. Her actual name was not Olympias, however, but Myrtale, and her ancestors claimed and believed that they were descended from Achilles, direct descendants of Achilles himself, an actual demigod in their world. And this profound belief in the divinity of their bloodline and inherent greatness she would pass on to her brilliant son, Alexander, who she loved dearly, and for whom wanted only one thing, that he become the king of all Greece. But for that to happen, her husband, King Philip, would have to die. When Alexander was a boy, around 12 or so, a lavish festival was thrown in honor of his father, the king. At the height of the revelry, a visiting dignitary presented to Philip a great gift, the most beautiful horse his people had to offer, a magnificent war stallion. The guests, as well as Philip, gasped as the horse was brought out. This was a beast out of legend. There was only one problem. He was untamable and extremely dangerous to anyone who had the courage or stupidity to approach him. Philip, the warrior king, made a great and rousing spectacle of publicly challenging his most tested soldiers to see which had the skill and bravery to mount this god of a horse. Man after man tried, and all were brutally attacked, leaving some with broken bones, some with worse. It was obviously impossible. The stallion would remain in stable, unridden, a beautiful and terrible showpiece. It was at this moment, when the men had given up, that 12-year-old Alexander stood up from his seat and shouted out for all to hear, "I'll ride him, father." The arena was shocked into nervous silence. This was impossible. But Alexander scanned the crowd calmly. For he had noticed something no one else had. The horse feared its own shadow, and this gave him an insight into its mind. At his father's gesture, the prince descended the stairs. Walking toward the stallion, beneath the high sun and the terrified eyes of his people, Alexander felt the electric thrill of belief in the work of the gods. This horse, this magnificent beast, fit for a hero, had been made for him in this moment. And here's the secret. Alexander believed in himself. He utterly believed in his own inherent greatness and worth. And that belief acts as a physical force in the world. People sense it. Animals sense it, most especially horses, which is why they are still used in therapy today. A horse can sense your inner disposition, and so can the rest of the world. If you believe, truly believe, so does everything else. As Alexander rode the massive warhorse around the arena, to the triumphant shouts of the crowds, his father's voice rose above the rest as he proclaimed, "O son, look thee out a kingdom equal to and worthy of thyself, for Macedonia is too little for thee." And he was right. Those words would ring in Alexander's ears as he held his father's dying body in that same arena only 8 years later, the dagger still in his bleeding chest, put there only moments before by the assassin almost certainly hired by his own mother. The breeze felt good. After a long day of study here on the rocky coast of Assos, Turkey, the breeze felt good. Not yet old, but not quite young anymore either. Aristotle had been the head of the academy here for a few years now, ever since his teacher, Plato, had died in Athens and left the real academy to his nephew. But now the time had come to leave yet another school. The Persians had arrived, and they had begun killing. Already his father-in-law had been tortured to death, and he and his wife were next. This was the end here, and yet, maybe a beginning. His old friend, King Philip in Macedon, had invited him to come live there in safety, on the condition that he teach his brilliant young son and heir, Prince Alexander, the future king. Maybe it wasn't the end after all. In 343 BC, when Alexander was 13, Aristotle arrived in Pella, the capital of Macedon and the site of King Philip's palace. It was an astonishing complex, the largest structure in all Greece. Macedon, which before Philip was considered a land of backwater barbarians, was swiftly becoming the center of the world. And herein lies the real reason Philip invited Aristotle to teach his son, to Greekify him, to instill in Alexander the refinement and power of high-class Greek rhetoric, philosophy, and culture, to essentially sharpen him from a blunt Macedonian axe into a razor-sharp Greek blade. Alexander, however, would not be taught in a palace. No, Aristotle built his new school many miles away at what was known as the Temple of the Nymphs, a secluded sanctuary near the town of Nausa. Here, nestled between lush trees and mountains, Aristotle would spend the next 3 years molding the mind of the greatest conqueror in history. From Aristotle, Alexander learned many things: the art of rhetoric and persuasion, to reason without surrendering to emotion, to love and be fascinated by the natural world, to observe everything as keenly as possible, but above all, and most important, to read and study classic literature. Here is the truth rarely discussed. It was through Alexander's study and love of Homer and the Iliad that his mind was able to expand to a degree capable of holding the scope of his ambition, of his potential. If Aristotle had not guided him through those pages, through those heroic and lofty classical ideals, it is entirely possible Alexander would have remained a simple regional warlord, just as his father was. The study of classical literature matures and opens the mind. It makes us larger, more capable. It allows our souls the space and sense of profundity to move toward our highest potential. And that is a lesson from Aristotle that we can absorb here today as well, as if we were seated right now alongside Alexander in the lush gardens of the Temple of the Nymphs. The people of Phrygia had been without a king for so long, none could remember a time of prosperity. In desperation, they finally sent a delegation to the temple of Telmosos to consult with the oracle. Bringing holy gifts and oils, they implored her, "When will we have a king once more?" After a long silence, the oracle answered, "The next man to enter the city driving an ox cart shall be king." Confused, the people returned home to ponder what the hell the oracle's prediction could mean. Not long after, a poor farmer named Gordius arrived, driving his old ox cart wearily into town. The people rejoiced and immediately proclaimed him king. Imagine the confusion of poor tired Gordius, now King Gordius. Out of gratitude, Gordius' son Midas, yes that Midas, dedicated the ox cart to the sun god Sabazios, whom the Greeks identified as Zeus, and tied it to a post with an intricate unloosable knot. It thereafter became known through the ages as the Gordian knot, and a prophecy grew around it. Whomsoever could untie and loose this impossibly intricate knot would become ruler of all Asia. And so there the knot would remain in the city square, unsolved, for 500 years. Alexander marched his army across the Hellespont into Phrygia, modern-day Turkey, resting little and moving swiftly, pushing his army hard. His men didn't mind. Alexander's campaign to conquer Persia had just begun, and they were still eager to follow their young, godlike king into history and legend. None yet had any idea just how far they would eventually go and what hells they would face. But first, there was a prophecy to be fulfilled and a riddle to be solved. And so it was that in 333 BC, Alexander entered the ancient city of Gordium to try his hand at the impossible. According to legend, Alexander strode up to the sacred knot and immediately began wrestling with it, desperately trying to pry it apart somehow with his hands. Time and time again he tried, and time again he failed. It was impossible. The rope was far too tight, and the knot was far too intricate. It simply couldn't be done. But instead of giving up, with a frustrated smile, as had so many dozens of other would-be kings, he stepped back, and according to one account, drew his sword high above his head, exclaiming, "It makes no difference how they are loosed," and swung his blade down, severing the ancient and holy knot. Imagine the shock of the priests watching. It's cheating! Now, we're not 100% certain whether it took one stroke or two. Personally, I prefer the one-stroke technique, but what we are sure of is what happened next. He was hailed and celebrated throughout the city for having solved the ancient puzzle, and the prophecy was declared fulfilled. Alexander would become king of the world. The term Gordian knot is still used today to refer to a problem that's just too complicated to solve, too intricate, too impossible. But here's the secret Alexander shows us. It's only an impossible problem if it's seen from an orthodox and traditional point of view. All problems are solvable if you can step back, remove yourself from the thinking of the herd, and then take decisive and unexpected action. All knots can be undone. Not all lessons learned from Alexander are uplifting and positive. This was a real person with real flaws, magnified by power on a massive scale. Some lessons are harsh. Some come from horrifying failures in character. This next truth is one of those. It was supposed to be a celebration, a feast of promotion. But all the generals in the banquet knew this was a retirement, a forced retirement of a great man, Clytus the Black, commander of the Greek cavalry under both King Philip and then Alexander himself. A man who for decades had led charges that broke empires. A man who had personally saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus. And here he was, at the height of his career and influence, essentially being dismissed by the arrogant young king he had sworn to protect. Deep in what is now Iran, Clytus was ordered by Alexander to take command of 16,000 defeated mercenaries and lead them for God knows how long on a campaign into the wild deserts. This was an obvious humiliation. For reasons we still aren't sure of, a rift had opened between Alexander and his young companions and the older heroes that had served his father. No longer could his generals speak as freely as they once would with Philip, as equals. Alexander was becoming something different, something more than a king, a god king. Fueled by wine and growing anger, Clitus spoke his mind. In response, Alexander stated that he was a far greater king than his father had ever been. Clitus stood and mockingly shouted that Alexander was nothing compared to Philip, just a boy pretending to be a hero who had inherited his army from his much more accomplished and self-made father, a true king. To prove his maturity, Alexander threw an apple at Clitus's head. Things escalated from there to the point where both men had to be restrained. Finally, consumed with blind drunken rage, Alexander grabbed a nearby spear and hurled it at Clitus, plunging it directly through his heart. The hall was shocked into complete silence and disbelief. That silence was eventually broken by a blood-chilling wail. It was Alexander. And so here's the truth. Clitus hit him directly in the center of the main nerve. Alexander's need to be unique in the world, to be greater than his father, to be a self-made god, destroyed his humanity. None of us build anything completely on our own. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, looking out at new horizons. And if we don't choose gratitude, then resentment will destroy us. Alexander never forgave himself. This complete surrender of reason, this unforgivable act of killing his friend, would haunt him for the rest of his life. It would not be long. We're still not certain exactly what killed Alexander, but what we do know is this. After a night of extremely heavy drinking, he awoke unusually hungover and sick. I've been there. So much so, however, that he called for his best doctors. Over the next few days, he grew worse and worse, weaker and weaker, until he was unable to get out of bed. Then finally, he lost the ability to speak, lapsed into a coma, and died. It happened so suddenly, and his generals were so unprepared for the loss of their king that his empire immediately lapsed into a brutal civil war that we now call the War of the Successors, tearing apart and reshaping the world for centuries. At 32 years old, Alexander was dead. King of Persia, Pharaoh of Egypt, King of Greece, ruler of all the world. All these titles couldn't save him from this ignoble and seemingly meaningless end, moaning in bed, terrified, probably shitting himself until he could move no longer. Medically, there are two theories. Either he drank himself to death by liver failure, or he was poisoned. Poisoned by his own men who had had enough of toppling empires for Alexander's glory, or poisoned by his own arrogant hand. Personally, I think he died from the latter. And so the final secret we learn from Alexander is a cautionary one. You see, what finally extinguished that fire, what ended that terrible but beautiful light that made the world tremble, was not an enemy's arrow or spear. It was his own hubris, his own utter arrogance in the face of mortality. That same unrestrained fuel that propelled him to impossible achievements, feats we still wonder at today, also led him to murder his lifelong friend in an uncontrollable rage, and then most likely drink himself to death. There is a balance to life. We all know this. The Buddha called it the middle way. The Greeks called it temperance. One of the most integral virtues in Greek philosophy, temperance teaches us self-restraint, control over our more self-destructive impulses. We all have them. Pleasure, rage. Think of tempering a sword. There is a proper balance needed between fire and water. Too much of either, and the sword will shatter. Alexander is a complicated character from a much more savage world. A destroyer of empires, a bringer of death, a shaper of maps. He's not a Disney hero. But though he had many faults, Alexander was undoubtedly a genius. What we can learn from him would fill libraries. His tactics and ingenuities are still taught at US military academies today. But what we can most take from him right now in our own lives is this. We don't have to be Alexanders. We don't have to be conquerors of nations or cities to be great. That's not the point, or the way to a fulfilling life. What we do have to be are conquerors of our own self-imposed limitations, our own fears and timidities and addictions. To view the world and our lives in it as a place and opportunity in which we can aim as high as we can imagine. And then to cut our own impossible Gordian knots with the same true belief in ourselves as that mad, vain, glorious spark of wildfire from ancient Greece that we call Alexander the Great. If you enjoyed this video half as much as we loved making it, please be sure to like, and share, and subscribe, and do all the things. It would truly help us out as we embark down this classic path together. Welcome to the family. Who's this?